Chapter 1. A Portrait Missing. In the quiet folds of the English countryside, nestled between the misty downs and curling hedgerows, lay the village of East Brackley, a place so serene and orderly that even the local gossip knew better than to shout. Morning routines ran like clockwork. Mrs. Finch opened her bakery at 7:30. Reverend Alderton's church bells chimed precisely on the hour, and the postman, Mr. Parsons, could be relied upon to pedal past Miss Templeton's garden gate at 11:30 sharp, ringing his bicycle bell twice, as though in greeting. On this particular May morning, the sky was dappled with soft clouds, and the scent of lilac drifted through the open windows of a modest ivy-clad cottage on Church Lane. Inside, Miss Jane Marple, that silver-haired lady, with the kind blue eyes and razor-sharp wits, sat in a high-backed armchair in the sitting-room of her old friend, Miss Lavinia Templeton. The two women had known one another since their school days. Miss Templeton, a former art mistress, now retired, and Miss Marple, well, something of an observer of life, with an uncanny knack for untangling its darker complications. On the tray before them were delicate china cups, a small dish of lemon slices, and a plate of crustless cucumber sandwiches that had clearly seen better mornings. "I tell you, Jane," said Lavinia, setting down her cup with an audible clink, "the portrait has vanished, simply vanished. One day it was there, glowering at me from above the mantelpiece, and the next it was gone, as if it had walked off on its own 2 painted feet." Miss Marple blinked. "Vanished from your sitting room? Yes, right from that very wall. I noticed it missing first thing this morning. The nail is still there. No sign of force, no mess, not a thread of dust out of place. Just no portrait. Colonel Templeton, wasn't it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Lavinia nodded. "My grandfather. Painted in full military regalia. Red sash, medals, the lot. It was hardly a Turner, but it had sentimental value. He stared at me through breakfast for over 20 years. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And no one else has been in the house lately?" "Only Mr. Dennis Willoughby. You know, that antiques chap from Much Hemsley. He came by on Thursday to value some of the furniture. Suggested I consider putting that walnut bureau of mine into the village auction in June." "Did he take any interest in the portrait?" "Not that I noticed. He glanced at it briefly, said something vague about post-Victorian stiffness, whatever that means, and spent more time examining the legs of my tea-table." Miss Marple looked toward the empty space above the fireplace. "And you're certain you didn't move it for cleaning? Or loan it to someone? My dear Jane, I've not the strength to lift a teapot these days, let alone a framed oil painting." Lavinia leaned forward, voice dropping slightly. "The thing is, it's not just the painting. Something feels off. I found a faint, muddy footprint in the corridor this morning, though I haven't been outside since the rain. And Persephone," she gestured to her tabby cat sprawled across the hearthrug, "has been acting strangely, hissing at shadows." Miss Marple didn't reply at once. She watched the cat thoughtfully, then turned back to her friend. "Perhaps you should mention this to Constable Ridgewell. Quietly. You know how these little things have a habit of growing larger if left unchecked." "I did think about it, but he's a nice enough man. Better with bicycles than burglaries, if you ask me. He once arrested the vicar's dog, by mistake. At that moment, the doorbell chimed, and Lavinia rose. "That'll be Mrs. Batley, come to collect the church flower list. Back in a tick." As Lavinia disappeared into the hallway, Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze wandering once more to the bare nail on the wall. The room was modest, filled with polished furniture and velvet drapes that had faded gracefully over time. But something, some subtle current, had indeed shifted. Moments later, the tabby cat stood up, ears pricked. A low growl formed in her throat. Miss Marple followed her gaze to the hallway, where the front door had just closed with a sharp click. Mrs. Batley, no doubt, but the cat's reaction spoke of something more unusual. Across the village, in the cramped book-lined back room of the East Brackley Historical Society, a young man named Jonathan Briggs stared intently at an old photograph under a magnifying glass. He was a thin, scholarly type with round spectacles and ink-stained fingers, prone to muttering to himself and forgetting his lunch. The photograph was of a long dismantled manor that had once stood outside the village, Templeton House. It, clear as daylight, was a younger version of the very same portrait Lavinia had described. Colonel Aubrey Templeton in uniform. But this version of the painting had something curious. A second figure, almost hidden in the background, a woman in a flowing dress, her face turned slightly away. A hand on the colonel's arm. Someone had carefully painted her over in the final version, it seemed, leaving only the colonel's stern gaze to judge the world alone. Briggs sat back, his stomach tightening with unease. If the portrait had indeed been stolen, perhaps it had nothing to do with its frame or brushwork, and everything to do with what had once been hidden beneath its surface. He reached for the telephone and dialed Miss Templeton's number. By afternoon, the village had erupted in a flurry of speculation. At Cresswell's grocer's, Mrs. Constance Weedle was loudly recounting how a band of London thieves had disguised themselves as chimney sweeps and stolen a priceless heirloom from Miss Templeton's sitting room. "Brought a ladder and everything," she declared. "Slipped in during the night, they did. It's these auctions. They attract all sorts." At the village green, 2 schoolboys were daring one another to creep up to the Templeton cottage and touch the haunted nail, while Reverend Alderton's wife swore she'd heard a strange knock at her window just past midnight. But no one, not even the most imaginative among them, suspected that a missing painting might soon turn into something far worse. And in her rose-covered cottage, Miss Marple began to make her quiet inquiries. She started with a list of names. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By the following morning, word of the missing portrait had spread through East Brackley like a gust of wind carrying autumn leaves. It began, as such things often did, in the narrow aisle of Cresswell's grocers, where Mrs. Constance Weedle, with a basket full of digestive biscuits and a tongue sharp enough to peel wallpaper, casually informed Mrs. Hackett that Miss Lavinia Templeton had been the victim of an art theft. "Gone, clean off the wall," she said with relish, her eyes glittering behind her half-moon spectacles. "And not a scrap of mess either, which to my mind means professionals, or someone with an awful lot of familiarity with her layout." Mrs. Hackett gasped, clutching her purse like it might be the next item spirited away. "But who would want that old painting? I remember that Colonel Templeton. He used to scowl at everyone at the garden fêtes. Looked like he disapproved of strawberries. Exactly, Mrs. Weedle replied triumphantly. Which is why it must have been stolen for some other reason. Sentimental? Or something hidden, perhaps? Smuggler's codes in the brush strokes? Or a treasure map tucked behind the canvas? By midday, the story had sprouted multiple heads. A criminal gang had broken into Lavinia's home using chloroform and rope ladders. The Colonel's portrait had been painted by a disgraced nobleman who'd hidden scandalous secrets in his art, or worse still, that Miss Templeton herself had sold it to pay off some undisclosed debt, now trying to reclaim it with a tale of larceny. No one truly believed the last theory. Lavinia was a creature of such unshakable routine that even her cat meowed in sync with her alarm clock, but it made for thrilling whispers near the churchyard. Through all of it, Miss Marple listened. She moved through her morning with the same grace she always did, pausing to inquire after Mr. Holbrook's gout, and taking tea with Reverend Alderton's wife, whose hearing was selective, but whose instincts were sound. She says the painting vanished, Mrs. Alderton repeated, knitting needles clicking. But it takes more than fingers to steal a thing like that. It takes intent. That's what the Reverend always says. Intent is half the sin. Quite, Miss Marple murmured, and not all sins are new ones. At 3 o'clock, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the Historical Society. Young Jonathan Briggs, still looking pale and slightly harried, was hunched over a sheaf of papers when she arrived. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, rising quickly and adjusting his spectacles. "You heard then?" "That the portrait is missing?" "Yes, though I suspect you've uncovered something rather more curious." He nodded and handed her a photo print. It was a copy of the archival image he'd studied the day before. Though grainy with age, the resemblance was unmistakable. Colonel Templeton stood beside a woman, features indistinct but posture elegant, and a hand lightly resting on his sleeve. A closeness not mentioned in any official biography. This second figure was removed in the final version, Jonathan explained. Painted over, I think. But it was there originally. I don't know who she is. Miss Marple studied the image. "Have you told Lavinia?" "Not yet. I thought I should confirm it first, but I do think she should know." "I'll speak to her. Thank you, Jonathan." Outside the Historical Society, the sky had clouded over, the spring sunshine briefly subdued by a sweep of slate grey. Miss Marple walked on, the image of the hidden woman lingering in her thoughts. That evening, she returned to Lavinia's cottage under the pretext of delivering a jar of quince jelly. Lavinia looked more tired than usual, her voice a little strained, her movements stiff. "I've barely slept," she confessed. "Every creak in the house makes me jump, and I keep thinking I saw someone outside the kitchen window last night, though it might have just been the wind." Miss Marple set the jelly down gently. "It might not have been nothing, Lavinia." Her friend blinked. "You think someone's watching me?" "I think someone may be ensuring that painting stays gone. You said Mr. Willoughby visited last Thursday. Did he inquire about anything other than the bureau?" "Well, he did seem quite taken with the hall mirror. The one with the eagle crest. He mentioned it had provincial appeal, whatever that means. But no, he said nothing about the portrait." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe I should like to speak to Mr. Willoughby. Do you know where he's staying?" "He keeps a little shop on the High Street in Much Hemsley. Antiquities and rarities." Rather a pretentious name, but he's charming enough. As they sat together, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the room filled with the warm golden light of evening. The empty space above the mantel remained conspicuously blank, its absent presence louder than any noise. Before she left, Miss Marple hesitated at the door. "Lavinia," she said gently, "did your grandfather ever mention a woman who might have been close to him? Someone the family didn't speak of?" Lavinia looked surprised. "No. I mean, he was married, of course, but my grandmother died young. No one ever talked about another woman." "Why?" "No reason," said Miss Marple. "Only that secrets, like paintings, have a habit of resurfacing, eventually." That night, as the village lights dimmed and the lanes fell quiet, a figure moved silently along the hedgerow behind the Templeton house. Dressed in dark clothes, their face obscured beneath a cap, they paused near the garden gate. For a moment they stood completely still, then with a swift movement slipped a folded piece of paper into the brass letterbox and vanished into the darkness. Inside, the house remained still. Persephone the cat stirred but did not wake. It wasn't until morning that Lavinia found the note. Written in narrow, neat script were just 4 words: "She should stay buried." Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The following morning, East Brackley stirred with a curious blend of rain-washed freshness and whispering unrest. The spring drizzle that had begun just before dawn now pattered gently on slate rooftops and curled through the hedgerows, giving the village a gloss of reflective quietude. But inside the minds of its residents, thoughts were louder than the church bells. At Lavinia Templeton's cottage, the fire crackled as she sat in her shawl, rereading the note for the 3rd time. The edges were damp now, slightly wrinkled from her trembling hands. She should stay buried. The words struck with a peculiar chill, at once ambiguous and unmistakably menacing. There was no signature, no mark, not even a smudge of ink or a fold. Just that thin, deliberate script dropped into her home like a curse. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 9, bearing a folded umbrella and a packet of seed cake. She didn't press Lavinia with questions, nor offer platitudes. Instead, she sat beside her friend, pouring tea into both cups and speaking quietly. "I'd like to see the note," she said after a pause. Lavinia handed it over. It was pushed through the letterbox sometime in the night. "I didn't hear a thing." Miss Marple studied the message carefully, then held the paper up to the firelight. "Machine-made, good quality stock, trimmed cleanly, likely from a writing pad rather than a torn sheet. The hand is confident but restrained, likely male, though one shouldn't assume. You think it's a threat. I think it's a warning or a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Miss Marple gave her a gentle look. "Perhaps of something you yourself do not remember, or were never told." Lavinia's expression faltered. "Jane, do you think this has to do with that photograph? The one Jonathan Briggs showed me. I believe it might, and I think we should take it seriously." After a quiet breakfast, Miss Marple took her leave and made for the vicarage. The Reverend Alderton, a lean and thoughtful man with a gentle disposition and a penchant for dusty theology, welcomed her into his study with a slight bow. His wife brought in tea, though Miss Marple politely declined, having just had her 2nd cup, and soon the two sat in comfortable silence as rain danced on the stained glass window. "I don't wish to pry," Ishi began, which of course meant she would. "But I wonder if you recall any mention of Colonel Templeton being romantically linked with anyone in the village? Someone other than his wife?" The vicar furrowed his brow. "Templeton? No, I don't recall any such talk. He was rather rigid, wasn't he? A man of great self-discipline, some said." "Yes. And others said control can sometimes hide chaos. I've found that to be true more than once." "Indeed," Alderton said, steepling his fingers. "There were vague mutterings years ago of some scandal or private rift. But you know how these things are. Reputations were guarded fiercely in those days. If anything improper occurred, it would have been buried thoroughly." "Buried? Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "unless, of course, something, such as a portrait, uncovers it." He glanced at her curiously, and she offered him the briefest of smiles. Before departing, she left a note with the vicar's wife, requesting a list of the oldest parishioners who might have known Colonel Templeton personally, especially anyone who had worked at or around Templeton House in their youth. "I believe the past has begun to echo," she said quietly, and I intend to listen closely." Her next stop was the village police station, a squat brick building near the crossroads, where Constable Ridgewell could usually be found polishing his bicycle or sipping tea from a chipped blue mug. Today he was doing both. "Well now, Miss Marple," he said with a smile as she entered. "Come to give me a new mystery to chew on?" "In fact, Mr. Ridgewell, I've come to share what I believe may soon be one. Or perhaps already is," she explained. "The missing portrait, Mr. Willoughby's visit, the altered photograph, and finally the anonymous note." Ridgewell's jovial manner faded as the tale unfolded. "I didn't realize things had gone that far," he admitted, scratching his chin. "When Miss Templeton mentioned the theft, I figured it was just some local boy looking for a quick profit." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, this isn't about profit. It's about something much older and rather more delicate. Someone removed that portrait for a reason, not because it was worth anything, but because of what it might have revealed." "You think it's the second figure in the original?" "I do." Ridgewell frowned. "But why now? That house has stood quiet for decades. The Colonel's been gone 20 years. Why stir it all up again?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely the question I'm hoping to answer. I suggest we have a quiet word with Mr. Willoughby before he decides to vanish along with the painting." Meanwhile, back at the Historical Society, Jonathan Briggs had taken it upon himself to begin reviewing Templeton House's old service records. Names of cooks, maids, groundskeepers, many had faded into history. But one entry caught his eye. A Miss Edith Mercer, employed as a companion to Mrs. Templeton during her final years. It wasn't a long posting, barely 8 months, but something about the gap in service afterward seemed odd. She had no references following Templeton House, no further employment, as though she'd vanished completely. He jotted the name down and marked the file with a ribbon. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk to the edge of the village, where an overgrown lane once led to the old Templeton estate. The house had been torn down after the war, too costly to maintain, but remnants of it still lingered. A cracked stone wall here, a rusted gate half buried in bramble, and the faintest outline of a once grand garden now consumed by weeds and thistle. She stood quietly for a moment, breathing in the damp scent of moss and earth. Then she knelt beside a collapsed section of wall and ran her fingers over something, half concealed in the mud, a shard of glass, thick, curved, gilded at the edge, not a beer bottle or broken jar, but the remnant of a picture frame. She stood slowly, tucking the shard into her handbag. That evening, a heavy silence settled over East Brackley, broken only by the soft drumming of rain on rooftops. But inside the homes and minds of its residents, the weight of the mystery had begun to take root. At her writing desk, Miss Marple carefully arranged her notes: the missing portrait, the second figure, the anonymous warning, Edith Mercer. She underlined one word in her notebook: buried. Then she drew a thin circle around it and waited for the rest of the truth to rise. Chapter 4. First Suspects. The following day dawned brighter than the last, but the clarity of the weather did little to disperse the thickening fog of speculation that now hung over East Brackley. With every hour, the gossip surrounding the vanished portrait grew louder, and so too did the pressure for an answer. As is often the case in small villages, suspicion began to drift toward the most convenient targets, those whose presence seemed just unfamiliar enough to be unsettling. None. The name Dennis Willoughby was on many lips. Mr. Willoughby, the antiques dealer from Much Hemsley, had been in East Brackley only a handful of times, and never for very long. He arrived in a powder-blue Morris Minor with a chrome luggage rack and a dash of aftershave that lingered unpleasantly in narrow hallways. To the untrained eye, he seemed harmless, affable even, but in a village where the last outsider had been a botanist who overstayed his welcome by discussing dandelion sex, Mr. Willoughby's easy manner and vague credentials made him ripe for suspicion. Miss Marple, however, was not in the habit of trusting the untrained eye. That very afternoon, she and Constable Ridgewell paid Mr. Willoughby an unannounced visit at his shop, Antiquities and Rarities, situated at the corner of a narrow high street in Much Hemsley. The display window was filled with a hodgepodge of curios: ivory letter openers, brass teapots, a chipped marble bust, and in the centre, oddly prominent, was a set of silver buttons arranged on velvet. A little bell tinkled as they entered, and the man himself emerged from behind a curtain, polishing a magnifying glass. "Well now," he said, startled, "a surprise indeed. Miss Marple, was it? And Officer Ridgewell," the constable said curtly. "We'd like to ask a few questions, Mr. Willoughby." Of course, always happy to cooperate. Has something happened?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "We're following up on your recent visit to East Brackley. You appraised a few items for Miss Templeton, did you not?" "Oh, yes, delightful woman. Very fine pieces, particularly that walnut bureau. Classic early Georgian." "And the portrait?" she asked softly. Willoughby blinked. "Portrait?" "Of Colonel Templeton." It hung above her mantelpiece. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Oh, yes, of course. I remember it now. Rather stern-looking fellow in military garb, yes. I didn't think much of it, to be honest. A little heavy-handed on the shadows." "And yet it disappeared the day after your visit." His posture stiffened. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with it?" "We're not suggesting anything," Ridgewell said. "We're asking questions. Can anyone confirm where you were on Friday night?" Willoughby let out a breath through his nose. "I was home, cataloguing an Edwardian tea set. My assistant Freddie was with me. He left around 10. "We may need to speak to him," Ridgewell said, making a note. Miss Marple stepped forward, her tone light. "And you didn't find the portrait noteworthy, not even its provenance?" He raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware it had any. It wasn't signed." "No," she agreed. "But some paintings are valuable, not for who painted them, but for who is painted in them." Willoughby frowned, but said nothing. As they stepped outside moments later, Ridgewell muttered, "What do you think? Bit too eager to help, wasn't he?" Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. She stared back at the window display. The silver buttons glinted dully in the sun. "Let's wait before we assume," she said. "There are other truths yet to surface. Back in East Brackley, the investigation's ripple effects had reached the local tea room, the Kettle's Whistle, where Mrs. Constance Weedle had taken it upon herself to solve the mystery without leaving her preferred corner table. Today she was interrogating Mary Finch, the baker's teenage daughter, who had mentioned once, in passing, that she'd seen a man in a hat near Miss Templeton's fence. "Are you quite certain it was a man?" Mrs. Weedle prodded, leaning across her teacup. "Well, I think so," Mary said, clearly regretting the original comment. "It was dark, and I only saw him for a second. But tall, wasn't he? And wearing a coat? Maybe. And the hat, was it wide-brimmed?" Mary hesitated. "Could have been. Or maybe it was just a shadow." Mrs. Weedle turned triumphantly to her companion. "A shadow, indeed, more like an accomplice. Mark my words, that antiques man didn't work alone." Miss Marple, seated nearby with a modest fruit scone, said nothing. But her ears, sharp as ever, took in every word. She would speak to Mary herself later, gently, without Mrs. Weedle's brand of theatrical extraction. Children often saw more than they realized, and they remembered far more when they weren't put on display. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her notes. She now had a modest list of names. Dennis Willoughby, with his vague answers and over-practiced charm. Freddie, the assistant, who might confirm or contradict Willoughby's alibi. Mary Finch, whose vague sighting might hold a detail yet to be uncovered. And the mysterious Edith Mercer, whose brief employment at Templeton House still rang oddly, hollow. And then there was the note. She should stay buried. It lingered at the heart of it all, dark and weighty. Miss Marple laid the slip of paper beside the photograph Jonathan Briggs had given her, the one showing Colonel Templeton, and the obscured woman. She took out her magnifying glass and examined the woman's posture, the angle of her hand. There was tenderness there, a familiarity, and yet her face was deliberately turned just enough to conceal the identity. Whoever she had been, someone had gone to considerable lengths to erase her. The portrait's removal hadn't been theft. It had been containment, a control of memory, the erasure of a presence someone feared would return, even through paint. Across the village, Lavinia Templeton sat in her armchair, the fire casting flickering light against the blank wall where her grandfather's portrait had once hung. She'd lived in that house for 40 years. She knew every creak, every draughty corner, but tonight it felt unfamiliar. The past was not merely knocking, it had found its way inside. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The rain returned the next morning, steady and unhurried, wrapping East Brackley in a hush that seemed to deepen the mystery hanging over it. Miss Marple, ever an early riser, sat by her window with her knitting untouched, in her lap, her thoughts trailing far from wool and needles. She was thinking about frames, not metaphorically, but quite literally, the frame of the missing portrait, or rather, the fragment she had found near the old Templeton estate, with its curved glass and gilt edge. It had no business lying in the undergrowth unless someone had gone there intentionally, perhaps to destroy the portrait or to hide it. She placed the shard in a small box and carefully locked it in the drawer of her writing desk. Then, hood firmly pinned and coat neatly buttoned, she set out into the rain. Her destination was the Historical Society, where Jonathan Briggs greeted her with ink-stained hands and a stack of ledgers. "I've been going through more of the old staff records, Miss Marple," he said at once, "and I've found something interesting about Edith Mercer." She nodded for him to continue. She wasn't just a companion to Mrs. Templeton. She was also listed as a live-in assistant for Colonel Templeton's personal affairs. That's unusual for the time, especially given how short her employment was. Only 8 months. What's more, after her departure, there's no record of her anywhere. No further employment, no marriage certificate, no obituary, nothing. Miss Marple's fingers twitched in her gloves, almost as if she'd been erased. Exactly. And here's something else. Templeton House received a private delivery from London 2 weeks after she left. No item listed, just marked as artwork returned for storage. That's when the official portrait is first mentioned in the household ledger. Before that, there's nothing. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes slightly. So, the portrait may not have existed in its final form until after Edith Mercer disappeared. Jonathan nodded. "I think the Colonel had the painting altered." "And what if the figure removed wasn't merely decorative?" she said softly. "What if the Colonel had something to hide? Not just sentiment, but something more binding. A relationship, an affair, perhaps even a child." Briggs looked stunned. "But surely Miss Templeton would know." "Not if it had been carefully kept from her. Families do not always share their truths, Mr. Briggs, particularly when shame is involved." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicarage once more. Mrs. Alderton welcomed her with a slice of seed cake and a warm seat by the fire. Miss Marple accepted both with quiet grace before directing the conversation, as she often did, to seemingly idle matters. "I wonder," she said, "if any of the older parishioners recall a Miss Mercer." Mrs. Alderton tapped her chin. "Mercer? Oh yes, Edith Mercer. I believe she was the niece of old Ethel Marchant, the churchwarden in the 20s. She was a strange girl, shy, very private, left rather suddenly, if I recall. Do you remember why?" "Oh, there were whispers," Mrs. Alderton said with a conspiratorial air. "Some said it was illness. Others, well, there were rumours she got herself in trouble." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Trouble? You know the kind. A young girl, unmarried, suddenly leaving town under a veil of secrecy. It wasn't uncommon in those days. The shame of it, poor thing. And no one heard from her again. Not a soul. As if she vanished." Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. Yes, as if she vanished. By early evening, a fresh piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly, in the form of Mary Finch. The young girl appeared at Miss Marple's door, soaked from the rain, her cheeks flushed. "I didn't know who else to tell," she said, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "Mrs. Weedle kept asking, but she doesn't listen, and I think maybe I remembered something." Miss Marple ushered her in, sat her by the fire, and handed her a blanket. "Take your time, dear." Mary took a deep breath. "It was the night the portrait went missing. I was walking past Miss Templeton's house. Well, sort of loitering, I suppose. I was hoping to catch sight of Stephen Hollis." Miss Marple smiled knowingly. "The blacksmith's apprentice?" Mary nodded, embarrassed. "Anyway, I saw someone near the back fence. They weren't wearing a wide-brimmed hat like I said before. That was just Mrs. Weedle putting words in my mouth. It was a man, I think, but he had on a raincoat with the hood up. I couldn't see much, but he dropped something." "Something?" "Yes, I didn't think about it at the time, but it looked like a canvas roll, long, narrow." Miss Marple's eyes lit subtly. "A rolled-up painting, perhaps?" Mary nodded again. "Maybe. He picked it up quick and walked off toward the lane. I don't think he saw me." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And why didn't you tell anyone this before?" "I was scared I'd be blamed, or that Stephen would think I was spying on him. You did the right thing coming to me," she said, reaching over to pat the girl's hand. "And you may have helped more than you know." That night, Miss Marple added 2 new entries to her notebook. Portrait was not removed through the front entrance. Witness saw figure near garden fence. Canvas roll observed, painting likely intact. But most importantly, she circled a name again, Edith Mercer. Because the past, it seemed, had not been erased completely. Someone remembered her. Someone feared her return. And someone, perhaps more than one, was willing to threaten and steal to ensure that whatever had been painted over in that portrait remained unseen. Miss Marple sat back, her eyes falling once more on the photograph. The woman in the background was not turned away by accident. It had been deliberate, a concealment, not an omission, but even paint, Miss Marple thought, cannot hide guilt forever. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The following morning in East Brackley began with the soft warmth of sunlight slicing through the dissipating fog. The birds had returned to their usual chorus, and the puddles along Church Lane were slowly drying. Yet under this deceptive normalcy, something in the village air had changed, tightened. Conversations grew more cautious, greetings briefer, and eyes watched more closely. At the heart of this tension stood Miss Marple, who now had a fragile web of facts and whispers in her hands. A vanished portrait, a painted-over figure, a woman erased from memory. And behind it all, a thread of something personal and guarded, something people had long preferred to keep buried. That day, Miss Marple invited Jonathan Briggs to tea at her cottage. He arrived with his usual flurry of notes and documents, his spectacles fogged slightly from the sun hitting his damp collar. "I've uncovered a little more," he said eagerly, settling into the chintz-covered armchair across from her. "It's about Edith Mercer." Miss Marple poured the tea and nodded. "Please, go on." She was listed as a parish school assistant in 1912, Then she became a paid companion to Mrs. Templeton in 1915, shortly before the lady's health began to decline. But the odd part is this. In early 1916, there's a record of her visiting a clinic in Basingstoke under a false name. Really? Miss Marple said softly, eyes narrowing. She called herself Miss Eliza Marchant, a slight alteration of her aunt's name. The clinic was known for providing discreet services for unmarried women in delicate situations. Miss Marple placed her cup down. A child, then? Jonathan nodded. That's the implication. And after that, she disappears. No further records, no marriage, no known relations, just silence. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, folding her hands. And yet the Colonel commissions a painting just after her departure, one that initially included a second figure, later painted over. Jonathan's voice dropped. You think she bore the Colonel's child? I think it's very possible. Then why erase her from the painting? Because the Colonel was not a man to risk scandal, and Edith was dispensable in his world. She was never meant to be remembered. Miss Marple left shortly after, heading not toward Lavinia's home or the constable's office, but to the blacksmith's shop. Stephen Hollis, lean and soot-smudged, was hammering a horseshoe when she approached. "Miss Marple!" he called over the din, lifting his goggles. "Everything all right?" "Oh, yes," she said lightly. "I just wanted to ask you something entirely unrelated to metal." His grin widened. "Go on. You were working the night Miss Templeton's portrait disappeared." "Mostly, yes. I remember Mary Finch passed by twice that evening." Miss Marple nodded. "Did you happen to see anyone near the Templeton cottage?" He hesitated. "Well, I did. Someone walked past at the lane with a bundle under their arm. I figured it was someone moving house, or maybe carrying kindling. Didn't think much of it." "Did you recognize them?" Stephen shrugged. "Too dark. But they moved like they knew the place. Didn't hesitate. Would you say they were young, old, middle-aged maybe? Bit stooped, actually. Not someone from out of town." She thanked him, turned, and made her way down the path. Someone local, someone older, someone with reason to walk the village lanes in the dead of night. At midday, Miss Marple paid another visit to Constable Ridgewell, who had taken to jotting timelines on a blackboard in the back room of the station. He looked up, rubbing his neck. "We've had reports. Someone saw Willoughby's assistant Freddie driving toward the coast on Monday. Alone. And Mr. Willoughby? In his shop yesterday, but clammed up once I mentioned the portrait." Miss Marple nodded. "I don't believe he stole it. He may have known it had value, but not in pounds." Ridgewell frowned. "So who then?" Miss Marple held up the note that Lavinia had received. "She should stay buried. A warning," she said, "not to Lavinia, but to someone else. Someone who might have started asking questions." "You think it was meant for Miss Marple?" Ridgewell asked, eyes widening slightly. She smiled faintly. "Not for me. For Lavinia. Because someone fears she may uncover a truth she doesn't yet know. Something about her own family. A truth hidden inside a portrait now missing. I suspect the note came from someone who had something to lose should that painting ever be found." "And you've someone in mind?" She didn't answer directly. "I'd like you to look into any private nurses or medical assistants who might have worked at Basingstoke in 1916 under assumed names. And also," she paused, See if Edith Mercer ever had a child registered anywhere near East Brackley." Ridgewell raised his brow, but took the note. "I'll ask." That evening Miss Marple returned to Lavinia Templeton's home, where the air was filled with lavender polish and the quiet shuffling of a cat. Lavinia greeted her with a brittle smile. "I've done nothing today but stare at that empty space on the wall," she admitted. "It's as if the room knows something's missing." Miss Marple sat beside her and took her hand. "Lavinia, I must ask you something difficult." "Yes?" "If you were to learn that your grandfather may have had another connection, a private one, with someone not spoken of in polite circles, would that shock you?" Lavinia hesitated, blinking. I suppose I would be surprised, but I wouldn't be devastated. It was a different time, wasn't it?" Miss Marple nodded. "It was. But even then, a man could be ruthless when preserving his legacy. I believe the painting was altered to erase a woman he wronged, and I believe someone in this village helped him do it." Lavinia turned pale. "Do you think it was someone I know?" "I do, and I think that person may have also taken the painting to keep the past hidden." There was a knock on the door. Lavinia stood startled. Miss Marple rose quietly, signalling her to wait. She opened it herself. Outside stood Reverend Alderton, his hat in hand, face unusually tense. "Forgive me," he said. "I think I have something that belongs to you." He held out a small wrapped parcel. Inside, folded with deliberate care, was a canvas roll, the missing portrait. Chapter 7. Another twist. For a moment, no one moved. The canvas roll lay between Miss Marple and Reverend Alderton like an ancient relic just exhumed, fragile, loaded with the weight of secrets too long buried. The Reverend stood with his hat in hand, his eyes flickering not with guilt, but something quieter. Weariness, perhaps, or resolve. Inside the room, Lavinia Templeton's voice broke the silence. You had it?" Alderton inclined his head. "I found it on the side, path by the vicarage, yesterday afternoon, wedged between the hedge and the garden wall. At first I didn't know what it was. I took it in, unwrapped it, and recognized the Colonel." "Why didn't you bring it sooner?" Lavinia asked, voice trembling. "Because I wasn't sure what I was looking at, or whether I had the right to return it." Miss Marple reached forward and gently peeled back the paper wrapping. The portrait, though smeared slightly along the edges, was intact. Colonel Templeton stared forward, moustached and immovable, just as Lavinia had described. But this time he was not alone. To the left of the Colonel, partially in shadow but unmistakably present, was a second figure, a woman. Her face was visible now, serene but resolute. The hand on the Colonel's arm was slender, pale and ungloved. Her eyes gazed not at the viewer, but at him. Affection mingled with something else. Perhaps defiance. Lavinia stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. "Who is she?" Miss Marple turned to Alderton. "That is what we must all try to determine." The Reverend gave a slow nod. "I believe she is the reason the painting was hidden in the first place." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Reverend, did you know Edith Mercer?" "I knew of her," he said. "My father was the vicar before me. I was still a young man when she worked at Templeton House. She used to visit the church sometimes, always sitting in the back pew. There were whispers even then. But one does not ask questions in a parish such as ours, not if one wishes to keep the peace. She disappeared, Lavinia said. No one ever heard from her again. Perhaps, Alderton replied, because she was made to vanish. The news of the recovered painting spread through East Brackley within hours, carried by Mrs. Wheedle's dramatic retelling at the post office, and confirmed by Mary Finch's wide-eyed account to her mother. It wasn't long before the entire village knew that the portrait had returned, that it revealed a second figure, and that the woman in the picture had been painted out, then restored. Speculation grew rampant. Who was she? Was she the Colonel's mistress, his illegitimate daughter's mother? A servant, a scandal, a secret? Inside the Historical Society, Jonathan Briggs stared at a high-resolution photograph of the painting and compared it to the archival version. The restoration wasn't recent, he told Miss Marple. It looks as though someone tried to clean away the overpaint, but stopped halfway. Some parts are muddled, but the intention was clear. Someone wanted her seen again, but not Mr. Willoughby, she mused. No, this wasn't about value. This was about vindication. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited Constable Ridgewell, who sat with his notes and a fresh pot of tea, frowning over a map of the village. Been looking into those old medical records, he said. No formal birth certificate for a child belonging to Edith Mercer. But there's a line in the church logbook, 1916. Private christening, infant female, mother, Eliza Marchant. Father, unknown. Miss Marple took the book and examined the handwriting. Eliza Marchant, the name Edith used at the Basingstoke clinic. Exactly. Miss Marple tapped the page. Then it wasn't the Colonel who took the child in. It was likely someone else, perhaps even a family member. That child would be, just over 40 now. Ridgewell nodded. And if that child remained in East Brackley, she said, slowly, she would be part of this community. Respected, ordinary, entirely unaware of what was hidden behind a canvas all these years. Ridgewell blinked. You think Miss Templeton has a half-aunt or cousin she doesn't know about? I think, Miss Marple replied, that someone born in silence has lived in silence ever since, and someone else would kill to keep it that way. That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her thoughts turning inward. She now knew why the painting had been stolen, not for its worth, but for its revelation. Someone had tried to bury Edith Mercer in layers of oil and varnish, just as they had erased her from the Colonel's legacy, and someone else, perhaps the Reverend, or someone even closer, had chosen to bring her back. But another presence lingered. The note. She should stay buried. That had not come from fear. It had come from control. The painting had not been removed to protect Lavinia. It had been removed to protect someone else, someone who had much more to lose. She stared at the woman in the painting, her soft face and strong gaze. Whoever she had been, lover, companion, or something more, she had been denied her place in history. Until now, and in restoring her, someone had triggered more than just old gossip. They had awoken the very thing the Colonel had tried so hard to kill. Remembrance. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The painting now hung in Miss Marple's own sitting room, propped on an easel borrowed from the village school. Lavinia Templeton had insisted it be stored somewhere safe, quiet, and away from staring eyes. And there was no safer place in East Brackley than the corner of Miss Marple's parlour, under the watchful gaze of her rose-patterned curtains, and beside a vase of dried lavender. Miss Marple had spent much of the morning studying it, not just the restored figure of the woman, but the fine brush-strokes, the subtle blending, the deliberate shadows that now revealed more than they once concealed. And in that muted corner of canvas, where the woman's hand rested gently against the Colonel's sleeve, Miss Marple saw not just defiance or affection, but connection, a claim, a presence, a fact that someone had fought very hard to erase, which was why that afternoon Miss Marple sent out 4 handwritten invitations on her finest cream stationery, a simple request: tea at my cottage, 4:30, a quiet gathering. J.M., the guests were carefully chosen. Lavinia Templeton, of course, Reverend Alderton, Constable Ridgewell, and one other, rather less likely figure, Mrs. Gwendolen, Marchant, a quiet widow who lived at the edge of the village and kept mostly to herself. She was, as Miss Marple well knew, the only living relative of Ethel Marchant, the late churchwarden and aunt of Edith Mercer. They arrived promptly, as the villagers always did for Miss Marple, out of both respect and curiosity. Tea was served in mismatched china, with lemon slices and currant scones, and for a few minutes conversation drifted harmlessly between flower beds, weather, and the vicar's lamentable attempt at growing gooseberries. Then Miss Marple rose, walked to the easel, and turned the portrait gently toward the group. "Now," she said softly, "I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wonder if we might speak candidly, among friends." They all turned to look at the painting. Lavinia's eyes rested briefly on her grandfather's face, then moved to the woman beside him. "She doesn't look afraid," Lavinia murmured. "She looks determined." "She was," Miss Marple said. "Her name was Edith Mercer." A hush followed. Mrs. Marchant's teacup clinked slightly against its saucer. "She worked at Templeton House," Miss Marple continued, "and she was, I believe, in a relationship with Colonel Templeton. Whether it was consensual or not, we may never know. But we do know she left East Brackley in 1916 under a cloud of shame, and that shortly thereafter the Colonel commissioned this painting." Ridgewell shifted in his seat. "And had her painted into it?" "Yes, and then painted out of it when her presence threatened to become too much of a liability." There was a beat of silence. "And I believe," Miss Marple added, her voice softer now, "that the Colonel may have fathered a child with her, a daughter." Lavinia inhaled sharply. Miss Marple looked to the vicar. "The christening record, from 1916, Eliza Marchant, infant female. No father listed, no further mention of the mother." Mrs. Marchant's face had gone pale. Her fingers gripped her shawl tightly. "And that child," Miss Marple continued, "was taken in by Ethel Marchant and raised as her niece. She grew up in this village entirely unaware of her true parentage." Mrs. Marchant stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous, idle speculation." Miss Marple looked at her with immense gentleness. "It's not meant as accusation, only understanding. I believe you, Gwendolen, are that child." The room fell utterly silent. Lavinia sat motionless. The vicar bowed his head slightly. Ridgewell blinked twice, but said nothing. Mrs. Marchant's lips trembled. "My aunt! She never told me." "She wouldn't have. It would have protected you. But I believe she knew. And when Edith disappeared, she made a quiet arrangement to raise the child as her own kin." "And the painting?" Ridgewell asked. "I believe it was Gwendolen who returned it. Not out of guilt, but out of justice. Someone found it. Someone showed her the original figure beneath. And once she saw it, really saw it, she understood. She didn't need to tell the world. She just needed the woman to be seen again." Mrs. Marchant's voice was barely above a whisper. "It was hidden in my aunt's attic, wrapped in cloth. I never knew what it was until I unwrapped it and saw her. I recognized her face. She looked like me." She sank back into her chair. "I wanted to keep it secret, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way forever." Miss Marple offered her a quiet nod. "Secrets never do." After the guests left, Miss Marple remained by the window, watching the evening settle over the village. Lavinia had taken Mrs. Marchant home herself, neither of them speaking much, but Miss Marple had seen the way Lavinia reached for the other woman's hand as they left. Constable Ridgewell lingered behind. "There's still the matter of the threatening note," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, that didn't come from Gwendolen. That came from someone who feared what she might discover." "And who would that be?" She turned toward him, eyes calm. "Reverend Alderton." Ridgewell looked stunned. "The vicar." "He found the painting, and he waited a full day to return it, long enough to see the restored image, and long enough to write a note, drop it into Lavinia's door, and try to put a stop to what he knew was coming, not out of malice, out of loyalty. His father served with the colonel. The Templetons helped rebuild the church roof. He wanted to preserve the past." "Preserve the lie, you mean?" "Yes," she said softly. "But a lie, even buried in paint, has a way of bleeding through." That night, Miss Marple returned the painting to Lavinia Templeton, who placed it quietly in the hallway, not above the fireplace, but along the side wall, where it could be noticed but not worshipped. "I want her seen," Lavinia said. "Not because she was hidden, but because she endured." Miss Marple smiled. The house, once filled with silence, now echoed with the truth. And that, in the end, was the one thing no brushstroke could ever obscure. Chapter 9. The reveal: it was not Miss Marple's habit to gather a crowd, nor to make pronouncements from grand parlour armchairs as though staging a play. Her methods were quieter, subtler, often mistaken for polite chatter and grandmotherly concern. But on the rare occasion when the truth demanded air, she allowed it the dignity of clarity. So it was with this case. 2 days after the return of the portrait, she invited Lavinia Templeton, Constable Ridgewell, Mrs. Marchant, and Reverend Alderton to a modest gathering. No tea this time, no currant scones, just the plain, still air of Miss Marple's parlour, and the unblinking gaze of Colonel Templeton and the restored Edith Mercer watching from the easel. The vicar arrived last. His face was composed, but there was a tightness about the mouth, and a stiffness in his greeting. He nodded to the others, avoided Mrs. Marchant's eyes, and folded his hands behind his back. Miss Marple began without ceremony. "I believe we have all come to understand the story behind this painting, though its full weight has taken time to settle. She gestured toward the canvas. This is more than a portrait. It is a document of suppression, of a woman's erasure, of a child hidden, of a truth buried not just in oil and pigment, but in conscience. Edith Mercer was not just Colonel Templeton's companion. She was, I believe, the mother of his child, a child who grew up here in East Brackley under another name. Her eyes turned to Mrs. Gwendolen Marchant, who sat still and composed. You have lived a life of dignity and grace. I do not believe anyone means to disturb that. But you were entitled to the truth, and to your place in that frame. Gwendolen's voice was quiet but steady. I never wanted to claim anything. I only wanted to know who she was, and why no one spoke of her. Lavinia reached over and took her hand. You have a right to know. Your family, no matter how long it's taken. There was a pause, and then Constable Ridgewell spoke. But someone wanted to stop that from coming out. Someone wrote the note to frighten Miss Templeton, and someone took that painting from her wall. And I think we all know who that was. All eyes turned to Reverend Alderton. He stood rigid, the light from the window casting soft shadows against his collar. I did not mean harm, he said quietly. Only caution. Miss Marple nodded gently. You found the painting near your vicarage and kept it overnight. But you had seen the restored figure. You recognized what it meant. You feared what it might unravel, not just for the Templeton name, but for the community you've guided for over 2 decades. I feared it would tarnish the legacy of a man who gave much to this parish, he said, and more selfishly, I feared it would reveal the silence I helped maintain. There was a beat of silence. It wasn't just the Colonel who erased Edith, Miss Marple said. It was all of you who knew and said nothing. The housekeepers, the staff, even the church. You let her go quietly into the dark. Reverend Alderton looked away. Yes. Ridgewell took a breath. You sent the note? I did. To whom? To Miss Templeton. I thought, if I could stop her asking questions. His voice trailed off, heavy with shame. She would have asked anyway, Miss Marple said, because she is a woman of good sense and a fair heart. Lavinia gave a small nod, and her voice, though soft, carried. I don't need the Templeton name to be pure, Reverend. I need it to be honest. My grandfather may have done good. He also did harm. Both are true. Miss Marple folded her hands, and the painting will remain intact, in this village, as part of our history, not a whisper, behind drawn curtains. There was nothing more to say. The truth had been uncovered, laid bare like a painting beneath cleaning solvent, revealing brushstrokes long hidden by time and guilt. After the others left, Miss Marple lingered by the window. Outside, the village continued its usual pace. Mr. Heddock, Parsons on his bicycle, Mrs. Finch unlocking the bakery door, the bell at the church chiming faintly in the breeze. Lavinia stood beside her. Do you think it's truly over? Miss Marple shook her head gently. Truth doesn't end things, my dear, but it clears the ground so something else might grow. They turned back to the painting. Colonel Templeton still stared with his rigid expression, but now, beside him, the woman in the shadows gazed forward too, her eyes calm, her hand resting gently, eternally, upon the truth of things. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The days that followed passed with a peculiar quietness in East Brackley, as though the village itself had paused to reflect. The spring air remained sweet, the gardens bloomed with confident colour, and the birds sang their usual morning chorus. But underneath the surface something had shifted, not drastically, not loudly, but perceptibly, like a small truth finally spoken after years of silence. At St. Agatha's Church, Reverend Alderton resumed his sermons with a quieter voice and a graver expression. He no longer invoked Colonel Templeton in the annual remembrance prayers, and though no formal confession had ever been made to his congregation, it was understood by those who mattered that something unkind had once been hidden behind his silence. Gwendolen, merchant, returned to her cottage. Her walks through the village now met with gentle nods and quieter conversations. No one confronted her. No one asked questions. But her eyes, once cast modestly downward, began to meet others directly, and occasionally a faint private smile would play at her lips as she passed the easel now standing in Lavinia Templeton's hallway. Because the painting had gone home. It had been restored, not just in pigment, but in purpose. Lavinia hung it not above the hearth as before, but in the side hall, in a place where visitors would pass it slowly, where one could see it, pause, and decide for themselves what the two figures meant. Colonel Templeton remained as stern as ever, but now, beside him, Edith Mercer, her name finally spoken aloud, stood unshrouded by shadows, no longer hidden by guilt or secrecy. Miss Marple visited Lavinia that following Sunday. The cat, Persephone, was curled in her usual place by the fire. The tea was hot, the scones fresh. Outside, the village green buzzed with laughter from children playing cricket. But inside the sitting room, there was a sense of completeness. A story, gently folded closed. "I still can't quite believe it," Lavinia said, pouring the tea. "All these years, a whole branch of my family just left out of the story." Miss Marple smiled. Families often tell stories backwards, beginning with what they wish had happened, then rewriting what did. Lavinia stirred her tea thoughtfully. "And to think Gwendolen and I have lived just half a mile apart, all our lives." "She never knew either," Miss Marple said gently. "Not until she saw the painting. And even then, she wasn't certain. It's remarkable how much a face can reveal when one is ready to see it. She's coming for supper next Thursday," Lavinia added quietly. "No ceremony, just conversation." "That," said Miss Marple with a satisfied nod, "is how healing begins." There was a pause as the two women sat in the soft quiet, the ticking of the mantel clock filling the room like the breath of an old house, remembering how to live. After a moment, Lavinia asked, "Do you think my grandfather ever regretted what he did?" Miss Marple took her time before answering. "I think he regretted the inconvenience, not the cruelty. Men like Colonel Templeton often mistake duty for honour, and when their secrets begin to weigh too heavily, they don't confess. They commission portraits." Lavinia gave a dry, sad smile, "and then they paint the truth out of them." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "but the thing about truth is, it tends to find its way back." The final pieces of the mystery settled quietly into place. Constable Ridgewell completed his report without fanfare, filing it in the village archives under the dry title, "The Templeton Portrait Incident." No arrests were made, No scandal published, just an adjustment of memory, a gentle nudge to the record. And that, Miss Marple believed, was as it should be. She herself returned to her garden, to her knitting, to her afternoon teas and quiet observations at the window. But every so often she would glance at her notebook, the one where she had jotted the earliest clues, and smile faintly at a single underlined word, buried. It had once referred to a painting, then a secret, and finally a woman, but no longer. On a mild Thursday evening, Lavinia Templeton and Gwendolen Marchant sat together at a modest wooden table, drinking wine and sharing roasted chicken, and stories they only now realized had overlapped for decades. No one else saw that moment. But Miss Marple, standing at her gate and glancing down the lane, saw the two figures in silhouette behind the curtain. And in her mind she saw two women, one in paint, the other in flesh, reclaiming their place in history. No fanfare, no final speech, just remembrance and truth.